Hi, I'm Tracy Guyry. I'm the director of the Poetry Archive, and I'm here with Simon Armitage, the Poet Laureate. We're going to talk about the BBC 100 collection, which the archive is presenting to celebrate the BBC's centenary, October 1922, when it began broadcasting. Also, 1922 included the publication of Joyce's Ulysses, of course, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, and across the Atlantic, Langston Hughes was publishing poetry, which he would read later for the BBC in the 1960s for the civil rights movement. It was an era of enormous change, but great hope. So, Simon, who stood out for you in that era?
It was an era of modernism and movement. I think quite often after big traumatic events, there's an expectation that the world and its cultures will settle back into, familiar positions. But it's often the case that that doesn't happen, that, people seek change of all kinds. And I think there were political changes going on in this era and literary ones. So Langston Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers, it's become one of those foundation stones of modern Black poetry. It insists on a noble inheritance, an heritage that goes all the way back to the beginnings of civilization and into pre-civilization, and conflates ideas of bloodstream with the flowing of some of the great iconic rivers of the world, some associated with grandeur and some associated with suffering and with slavery. And so that those rivers flow with both pride and melancholy for the poet in that poem. They're a place of home, a source, an origin, and they're a place of dislocation. And I think in more traditional areas of literature, in the sort of usual suspects, if you like, Ezra Pound's Canto, it looks like a difficult poem. I mean, it is a difficult poem, but once you know that it's about Odysseus going down to the underworld in book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, everything becomes really clear. In fact, it becomes more than clear. It becomes luminously ornate with the sort of language that feels ancient and in tune with its classical setting. So it's a poem about speaking to the dead, and perhaps we could associate that with the aftershock of the First World War. I mean, all poems are at some level about trying to communicate with those people who are no longer with us anymore. And Odysseus is seeking an audience with Tiresias, the blind prophet, for advice on how to return to his home kingdom of Ithaca and to Penelope, his wife. It deals very quickly with Anticlea, Odysseus's mother. The poem doesn't really get into why she's dead and why she's in the underworld. So I think Freud would have something to eventually say about that.
In the 1930s, John Masefield became Poet Laureate, and it was still early days of radio and certainly BBC radio. And he prophesied that radio could bring into existence new poetry for a new audience. So how do you think these new voices and new approaches were beginning to change through the 1930s? Is it fair to say that poets began to be more direct?
I think the BBC, and particularly BBC Radio, had an enormous influence on the landscape of poetry. Firstly, because it offered such opportunity. I think it's right to say that the BBC is still the biggest commissioner of new written work in the UK. And it began to offer possibilities for poets to give readings of their work, without necessarily being in a place of public performance. And I think this changed the understanding of what poetry was to both the poets and the listeners. And I think it gave opportunities as well to poets that otherwise might not have got a look in through, the regular channels at the time, which were very male and metropolitan dominated. So in this era, I'm drawn to Stevie Smith and her poem, Mother Among the Dustbins. It's typical Stevie Smith poem, big subjects disguised with simple, almost knowingly childlike language and these apparently gawky rhymes. And it has a disarming honesty that I don't think we've always appreciated in poetry. She's a great game player in her work. She's a sketcher and a doodler, and the poems can be very toy-like and very cartoon-like as well, not dissimilar to the pencil drawings that she often published alongside them. And I read this poem, Mother Among the Dustbins, as something of a dialogue between an inquisitive child asking one of the great unanswerable questions and an intellectualizing mother who can't outthink her innocently knowing offspring. I love the domestic detail in the poem, the contrast between the trivia of its setting and the lofty subject matter. And I can't imagine that poems like this and poets like Stevie Smith would have made their mark in the same way without having the channel of the BBC to broadcast within.
Yeah, is there a sense perhaps that as much as audiences were finding new poets through the BBC, that poets began to realise there were more audiences, and that helped bring new voices forward?
It was definitely the case that, as the 20th century moved along, that the franchise for poetry was becoming widened. Education in Britain was being offered to more and more people outside what we used to think of as the educated classes, and they became a new audience for poetry as well as poets in their own right. Eventually the grammar school systems and so on and so forth. So I think the BBC played a massive part in extending the cultural franchise of the country through the classes.
Sadly, the 1940s brought another decade dominated by global conflict. But in 1941, the weekly BBC magazine called The Listener asked Robert Graves, and they were calling him a war poet at that time, to explain why the Second World War had produced so little great poetry so far. And it was, in Graves' reply, that it was a different kind of war. But it was still a very prolific decade for poetry, included Robert Graves' The White Goddess and Graham's Night Fishing, two completely different approaches. So are we still perhaps grappling with a world where all the certainties are gone?
I think after the First World War, there'd been an expectation that the world, or particularly the Western world, but would settle down. And it became clear to a great many people that wasn't going to be the case, that matters were still unresolved. And I think literature had the shadow of the First World War poets hanging over them still. In some ways, they will never be replaced, because I think it was the last occasion in which trained literary minds also went on to be trained soldiers. So you were getting first-hand accounts of war by really excellent writers being sent back home straight away. And they were the bloggers of their day. They were undermining the official news channels with very strong, very crafted work. And I think it would have been impossible for the next World War to have assumed the same importance. In lots of ways, I think poetry was still quite imitative at that time. But it was an era where we had incredible writers looking maybe outside of those subjects. So W.S. Graham's The Night Fishing, an absolute masterpiece. R.S. Thomas, Edith Sitwell writing at that time. But to stay with Robert Graves, whose reputation had been made in the previous war as a war poet and as somebody who had been declared dead at one point and a death certificate issued. His poem, The White Goddess, I have to mention that on a personal level because it was one of the first poems I ever learnt by heart. A wonderful poem of refusal to accept the masculine world as it had been handed down across generations in the West, and an adventure poem, one that sets off through these epic geographies to find a more feminine presence at the root of all art and religion and myth, beautifully crafted, something close to being very sacred in those verses.
Yes, yeah, I always love that pagan, all of the pagan references through Graves's work. And on that theme of that widening audience, the 1950s, a British literary magazine called Nine asked its readers whether the BBC and literary periodicals are carrying out their responsibilities to poetry. And the public answered back to this that they would like to see the BBC encouraging more poets, more new poets, which is a call that still goes out today. How did you choose a poet from this era?
It's interesting in the 50s because a lot of the poets who we think of now as the major poets from that era were being invited to give readings of their work, and I think that's how a lot of people would have first encountered them rather than on the page. I mean, there's three of the big names of, you know, mid 20th century poetry here. Larkin, that pillar of English verse with all his sourness and morbidity. Though in fact Larkin was unusual because he was extremely camera and microphone shy. So there aren't that many recordings of him or appearances by him on TV and radio. You've got Sylvia Plath, you know, that tortured soul and feverish reporter of her own anguished life, who will forever be yoked in literary history with husband and former poet laureate Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes was actually employed at one point as a reader of poetry, not necessarily his own work, by the BBC. He gave voice to other people's poems. Again, on a personal note, if it wasn't for Hughes, I wouldn't be writing. Poems like Pike alerted me to something really essential and elemental going on in the world, something that I hadn't really realized could be captured and relayed just using the alphabet. And his animal poems were one of the gateways to contemporary environmental thinking and writing among later and junior poets. So he will always be somebody who I can't really get beyond as a writer. He was the poet from, you know, the next valley, and that always made me think, well, if he can do it coming from there, I can do it coming from here. And hearing his voice and the great gravity that came with his voice is one of those really momentous experiences in poetry that you never ever forget. You take that voice back into the written work.
That idea of the one poet reading their own work, the BBC did used to employ those readers. So it employed actors and other people to read poetry. But through the 1960s, the decade began with new format for poetry programs, such as The Living Poet, which was the first program to start inviting a single poet to come and read much of their work in their own voice. So it recognized, again, those audiences, they didn't just want to read poetry themselves, but they were interested in the poet and the poet's actual voice, which is also the basis of the Poetry Archive. So it was a remarkably experimental decade. It must have been difficult for you to pick out particular voices in the 60s.
Yeah, an enormous proliferation of work through that decade. And I think as well, a move towards, you know, the cult of the author. People were getting more and more interested in the characters and personalities behind the work. And a lot of the programs wanted poets to talk about themselves and their attitudes and the way they lived and so on and so forth, partly as a way of explaining the poems and making them a little bit more approachable, but also because I think there was, you know, during that decade, an increasing curiosity, we might even say voyeurism, about the lives of writers. I'd choose Anne Sexton's poem Her Kind from from this era. It's probably her most famous poem, and unusually lyrical for an American poet of her generation. It's a poem that disputes the traditional definitions of womanhood by inhabiting some of the cliched and dangerous characteristics of witchcraft. It becomes a kind of spell, really, a chant or an incantation. And at a deeper level, I think it speaks to what we would now call mental health issues these days, in what back then we would call a confessional style. So that past tense of the refrain in the poem, it's really intriguing. Are we listening to recollection, or are we listening to the living voice of a ghost? I remember this poem sending me to the dictionary to look up what a skillet was. And this whole era actually of American confessional poetry, so Sexton, Lowell, I would pull Plath into that group, Elizabeth Bishop. For me, just incredibly exciting and important. You know, when I was learning to be a writer, I was becoming a little bit exasperated with certain periods of British poetry, which often sounded like a man leaning against a piano, smoking a cigar. And I've never been that keen on poems that sound like thinking, and poems that sound like writing. But in American poetry, there was something more liberated there. The noise of somebody actually talking, but elevated into something else, something approaching song. Poems that found lyricism in the spoken vernacular word. And that was a big turn on for me at that point as a writer, and as somebody who was trying to come at literature from outside, the traditional channels and canons.
It's hard to see how many voices could have got such a large profile without something like the BBC. Otherwise, it was audiences that you could read to in person. So BBC had a really formative moment in, as you say, there's the cult of the author, but just in creating that idea that people can contact and have a much more personal relationship with poetry.
And that's particularly true of radio. Radio is extremely personal. It's extremely intimate. I mean, a crude example, but if you think these days about the amount of swearing and, inverted commas, foul language that we will tolerate on TV, it's almost expected these days, both, before and after the watershed, if the watershed still exists. But you simply couldn't do that on radio. Language has a direct route straight into your ear and to your senses and your sensibilities, and everything's amplified and tuned up. And I think that's why BBC Radio has always been such a strong comrade of poetry. They are very similar art forms. They rely on the art of suggestion and innuendo. And of course, when you can only hear words and you can only hear a voice, then your imagination has to do quite a lot of the work for itself. And that's true of the eye when it encounters text on a page without the supply of images that we get on TV.
And of course, as the audiences began to diversify and the poets began to diversify, the BBC needed to look at new ways to speak to an ever-widening audience. And poetry began to reflect both the violence and liberation of the times on more global scales. And just as an aside, in 1978, the Poetry Society and BBC launched the National Poetry Competition. It's a sense that poetry is returning to that oral tradition, that poetry owned by the people, do you think?
To some extent, I think the BBC has been an essential ally in opening up what is always in danger of becoming quite an aloof art form to a wider number of people. But I think it's important to remember as well that the BBC has also had a hand in keeping standards high as well. You know, in trying to define what poetry is, what makes poetry strong, and that's always to do with its relationship with language. And I think the BBC, in terms of its relation to poetry, has helped encourage people who want to say something about their situation in life to do so through, you know, strange word, but an interesting use of language. All programs have editors in the way that, you know, most books have editors, and there will be people who point out weaknesses in writing and encourage the, you know, the upward direction in the making, or particularly of commissioned work. I think for the BBC. I was thinking about Tom Gunn's poem, The Discovery of the Pacific, as really crucial in some ways to this era. It's a poem of sexual liberation and personal freedom. You know, and it might well be an autobiographical poem. It might well be true. It describes the journey, the speaker's journey across America to wake up one morning staring at the huge Pacific Ocean on the other coast. And it's a perfect conceit for a man escaping the narrow thinking of his native England in the 60s and arriving in, you know, a hippified California of the mind and body, an experience that caused something of a sea change, not just in Tom Gunn's lifestyle, but in his work as well. I'd also point to Geoffrey Hill's Mercian hymns. In this era, I'd give it a shout out. That being a term that I'm sure he would have found vulgar and unliterary and offensive. So this was quite early work by Geoffrey Hill, and some would say it's his best and among the best of the century.
That diversity of the poetic voice and experience continued through the 1980s, and more peripheral voices came in. Punk poetry, John Cooper Clarke certainly was my introduction to poetry back in the days of gigs, and wrote poetry for audiences, or poetry began to appear for audiences that were not usually catered for. This was obviously a big, very exciting time. You were actively writing at that stage as well. So who stuck out at you for this era?
I started publishing poetry in the late 80s in magazines, and then eventually in book form. And it's interesting for me to reflect that in the time that's passed since then, how much the definition of the word poetry has widened. I think it was pretty narrow back then, but people like John Cooper Clarke were taking poetry to very, very different places, and some quite dangerous places as well. You know, to stand up at a gig in front of a really wild, raucous punk crowd and recite verse. They were known as ranters at the time, the people who did that, the ranting poets, was pretty brave. You know, you're making yourself very vulnerable. And of course, John Cooper Clarke's gone on to become something of a national treasure now, and his work is used in the GCSE syllabus. And you couldn't have imagined that at the time. I don't think he would have imagined that. He was very anti-establishment. A lot of the poets, I think, who set themselves up at that time were writing against the poetic establishment, whatever that was. And you know, we have probably all become that establishment now. Salima Hill might be a case in point. I mean, she's a real one-off. I can think of who she might have learnt from. Stevie Smith, for example, or maybe Elizabeth Bishop, maybe some Edward Lear, but I can't think of anybody who writes or has written like her. She's a chronicler of periods of psychological hospitalization, and of a mind that occasionally has a mind of its own, if we can put it that way. She's also written consistently and really troublingly about being hounded and haunted by male presences in her life, these shadows and shades that never quite materialize from the background, but they never disappear either. And she can also be very funny in an absurdist sort of way. And she's a tireless maker of original and unexpected metaphors. I very much associate her work with that period, or as somebody who was beginning to make a new kind of work through that period. And I definitely heard Salima reading on the BBC on radio before I encountered her work on the page. I mean, you forget, but back in the 80s, it was still quite difficult to get hold of books. It wasn't like now, you know, with the internet, where you can get everything anywhere all of the time. Certain publications were just difficult to actually get in your hands. So at that point, the BBC and their literary programming across, well, particularly Radio 4 and Radio 3, to somebody growing up in a village on the edge of the Pennine Moors, it was a godsend and a lifeline.
And in the 1990s, all that youthful exuberance, the things can only get better culture, the British Britpop, and BBC called poetry the new generation of poets, and arts journalists were debating if poetry was the new rock and roll. Yeah, how was it for you, the 90s?
Poetry is the new, what did they say? Poetry has replaced stand-up comedy as the new rock and roll. Well, guess how that worked out. I think what was happening at that time, even though we might not have recognized it then and didn't really see ourselves as a movement, but a lot of us were Thatcher's children. We'd grown up seeing how language was being used and misused across this ever increasingly important thing called the media. You know, on adverts, TV, cinema, we'd seen the blatancy of it. And I think at a subconscious level, we'd wondered how that could work for us in our own poetry. Why did poetry have to be this shy wallflower of an art form? Couldn't it get out there and get stuck in the same way and be brash, but still try and hold on to its literary merits and its traditions and its craft and its roots? So yeah, I see my own name attached to a list of poets from that era, which must mean I'm a poet of the past, along with a lot of my contemporaries and friends. So I love the exuberance of Jackie Kay's work. Even when she's protesting injustices and wrongdoing, there's always high energy going on in those poems and musicality. I think it's interesting in this era how we've moved from the psychology of earlier decades to, the day-to-day sociology of more recent politics. But I've got to mention in this section, in this decade, a Deep Sorriness Atonement song by my poetic comrade Glyn Maxwell, because I was there when he premiered it, even though he wasn't. So at that time, we used to do an evening slot on BBC Radio 1 on the Mark Ratcliffe show, which I think speaks to some of those changing values about where poetry could legitimately happen. I think we were supposed to be their literary correspondents. Anyway, Glyn forgot to show up one night, so sent that poem as an apology. All is forgiven, Glyn.
And then, of course, the 2000 brought the new millennium. BBC is now, and had by that stage, become a really significant force in UK poetry culture. It gives this platform to poets that they would otherwise not be able to have. It introduces them to new audiences, and they started to bring in new programs. The Verb started in 2000s. The Living Poet began to expand the idea of the poetic. What stands out to you for the collection? These are increasingly contemporary poets who are still writing today.
I think the emergence of what we would call Englishers rather than just English, poets, editors, program makers, audiences, readers, starting to listen with a different ear and look with a different eye and become much more curious and accepting of voices that hadn't really been given their fair due in previous decades. That was an enormous change. And even though, you know, things are by no means perfect, I'm proud in the way that, you know, over more recent decades, poetry has been, I think, one of the first art forms to make these readjustments and to acknowledge voices and recognize other voices and recognize poetic cultures that you know have been essential and elemental, but just hadn't been given opportunities through, you know, the normal channels across the, you know, previous century, really. And I think Patience Abgabi might be an example of that. She's developed a real talent and well-earned reputation for taking pre-existing stories and pre-existing texts and representing them in contemporary language and contemporary settings. So I'm thinking of that poem of hers, Man and Boy, which merges the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac, a parable used by Wilfred Owen as a metaphor for the slaughter and carnage of World War I all those years ago, and also taking the story of Isaac being duped on his deathbed by his wife Rebecca and his son Jacob. Any Bible story with a Volvo in it is always going to work for me. I love the control and the imagery of the first four lines. She writes, "Open the blind, son, wide. I'm not dead yet. Do you hear the hail like it was deep frying? Your mother says forked and sheet lightning at the same time spells trouble. I know she is."
Turning to 2010, the final decade, this is 100 years that the BBC has been relaying poetry and broadcasting poetry. It's now listened to by 2/3 of the UK population. It's telling the stories of millions of people, poetry. And as you say, it's one of those art forms that seemed to be, was either able or just did react really quickly to telling all those different stories in different ways. Looking forwards, do you think poetry is in good shape?
I'd like to think it's in good shape. I think it's in better shape now than it was when I started being interested in it. On the other hand, my reason for being interested in it was as a form of resistance. I've always thought of poetry as being something that is unbiddable and won't play along with the mainstream. And I think whenever it is in danger of becoming genuinely popular in the way that other art forms are genuinely popular, then it probably needs to go away and reinvent itself as a form of opposition, as something alternative. I've said this before, but it's still true for me. If everybody was walking around with a book of poetry under their arm, listening to poetry 24 hours a day on the BBC or whatever other platform, I don't think I would be the slightest bit interested in it. I like the fact that it's doing something different. And I think if it becomes really, really popular, then it probably means it's become facile in some way. So it's always swinging around within some fairly narrow parameters and has to be, otherwise it's not really doing its job. And I hope that doesn't sound like a grumbling comment by the poet laureate, because poetry is a system of belief that I live by, but it simply cannot be for everybody. It just it wouldn't have any kind of purpose if that were the case.
And that sense of shape, do you have how that shape has changed over the 100 years? There used to be that sense of gatekeepers, which seems to be opening up a lot more. The gatekeepers are different or gone?
Yeah, well, of course, gatekeepers open gates as well as keeping them closed. But I think the nature of who those gatekeepers are and where they are has radically altered, all for the better. It's brought us voices that we simply wouldn't have heard before. That's been an enormous triumph over these last 20 or 30 years. But I was actually thinking of the poems from this era in terms of a poet who'd brought something old and traditional into the contemporary world. So I was thinking about Jacob Polly's poem Lanley Lane, and it's a kind of contradiction in terms, because it takes an old form, the ballad, to describe a stabbing that sounds very much like the consequence of a latter-day gang fight or turf war. So the poem takes that trick even further. The rhyme and rhythm and vague setting of the poem can lead us into thinking that this could have been a historical incident, but the mention of sirens and then a mobile phone popping up in the poem deliver it immediately into the immediate. And I find the mother's incredulity. at the end of the poem, when she repeatedly asks her son if he's walked from Lanley Lane, almost unbearable. Not just because the lane is presumably on the wrong side of town or on somebody else's patch, but because of the distance that the boy's covered nursing this stab wound in his chest.
And to finish, if we return to that question, the British Literary Magazine 9 asked its readers whether the BBC and the literary periodicals are carrying out their responsibilities to poetry. What in future for BBC and poetry would you like to see in an ideal world?
I think there's a bigger question here about the future of the BBC in general. It's very much under threat from all sides. And I've asked people in the past to think about what the, not just the broadcasting landscape of this country, but what the cultural landscape of this country would be without the BBC. I mean, from my point of view, it's been a free education in all kinds of subjects above and beyond degree level. But I'm somebody who stopped, I haven't been educated in poetry since I was at school. I took a geography degree. I was a probation officer in Manchester. I've done all kinds of jobs, but none of them have involved studying English beyond A level. It's the BBC as much as anything else has afforded me the opportunity to learn, and has opened up incredible possibilities for me as a reader and as a writer. And I'd like to think that won't change, because the duty of the BBC is one which has a responsibility to literature in a very wide sense. But from all the people that I know who work at the BBC and their interest in language, and I keep banging on about this, poetry is about language at the end of the day. I think as long as there is a BBC, then poetry will be in pretty good hands, because the two things in this country for over that period of 100 years have gone hand in hand.
And that's why the Poetry Archive is especially delighted to be celebrating this 100 years of BBC poetry, so that our visitors can come and explore a huge range of poetry that they've been broadcasting. And yes, long may it continue. Simon, thank you so much for your input, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
It's a pleasure.